every single king is compared to whom? Do you know? So who's the first king of Israel? Jeroboam. And so he leads the people into idolatry because he actually doesn't want the people to come to Jerusalem to worship. So he sets up high places and he sets up another place to sort of compete with Jerusalem. And every king that follows him, which 100% of them are wicked in the northern tribes, every one of those kings is compared not to David or to God, but to Jeroboam. Isn't that? It's not just interesting, it's tragic. That all the kings are found in relationship to who Jeroboam was. Just like Jeroboam, he led the people into idolatry, or he furthered the idolatry. So it begins with Jeroboam, and by the time you get to the end, when the Ninevites come and or the Assyrians come and take them, they don't even know who Jehovah God is. He's unrecognizable to them. They're worshiping with these Asherah poles and all of these other elements, and they're not worshiping Yahweh at all. They're actually sacrificing their children to the gods of the Baals, which there were multiple gods of the Baal, but 3 primaries. And so that's what they're doing. And they're actually putting their children in the oven and cooking them, their firstborn. And what did God want for the firstborn of the Israelites? He wanted them to redeem them, right? Just like he had redeemed his firstborn child, Israel, right, from Pharaoh. That was the process of redeeming the firstborn. And so he wanted his people to do the same thing. And they were to remember that every year in the big feast called the Passover. Every king in Judah was compared to whom? To David. It's an interesting contrast, isn't it? David's a man after God's own heart, and in a very real sense, and I don't know that we'll get to these main passages about that tonight, but one of the things that you need to see is that David actually sits on God's throne. It's not David's throne. He's sitting on God's throne. And he will be moved, and eventually Jesus will be in his place. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in Daniel and Ezekiel and Jeremiah that we'll look at that helps us understand that sort of lineation there. But in Matthew, there's a fascinating thing. There's several characters. What's your understanding of the differences between the genealogies of Matthew and Luke? Have you studied that before or thought much about it? What's the difference between Matthew's genealogy and Luke's genealogy? Just name one thing. There's several differences. Name something.
Who they follow.
Who they follow? Okay, so say that again. Like, what do you mean?
Well, whether it's the mother's side or the father's.
Okay, so right. So most people believe, now Mary is never mentioned in either one of them, but it's believed that what Luke is tracing is Mary's genealogy, right? And I think that makes sense because Luke, as a physician and just as a historian of someone who, he tells stories that the other gospel writers don't pay attention to. He is intrigued with things that Mary thinks and has a hard time understanding the significance of or sees a lot of significance of. So he really traces the personal aspect of Mary's journey, to some degree Jesus' personal journey. Matthew is the first gospel because what he's trying to do is tie Jesus to what? To David, to Abraham, to the Old Testament, to the law, right? And so he divides his gospel into 5 sections, and there's a whole bunch of it is written stuff, and not that Jesus didn't say that when the other gospel writers were writing theirs, it's just that Matthew pays attention to that some more, right? So he's emphasizing things. Matthew's genealogy is tracing only back to Abraham. Does that mean that he wasn't like a descendant of Adam? Of course not. So Luke is going all the way back to Adam. Why the difference in that part of it? So one of them goes to Abraham, one goes to Adam. Why do you think that might be?
Because Luke was writing to Gentiles when they needed
Yeah.
to go back to humanity.
Good. So Adam, or mankind, as his name is, right? Humanity. So Adam, Luke is going all the way back and tying all Gentiles back to Adam too. Jesus is just one of us, but he traces him through David as well. And then when Matthew does the genealogy, he traces only back to Abraham because he's the father of the Hebrew nation, right, of the Jews. So that's one difference. There's another difference in the fact that it seems like what Matthew is doing is going through Joseph's history, and Luke is going through Mary's. So what happens in Matthew's genealogy is something that's pretty interesting. So I don't think anybody reads through these genealogies and knows all the names, but you know some of them, right? So let's just kind of hit some of these here. In Matthew 1, let's just start at the very beginning here. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Terah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron. So there, remember the twins that Tamar has? Remember she basically becomes a prostitute because of Judah's promise that he left unfulfilled. So she wants to get him back. Judah had 3 sons initially, right? And then it's the 4th son that winds up being the father of Jesus, right? So it's Perez, not Zerah. But anyways, so she has twins by Judah. And so those 2 are mentioned, but it's Perez who carries on the name. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab. Remember, we talked about her already. Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. You got 2 women already. Obed, well, you have Tamar too, but sorry, I just lost track. And Obed, the father of Jesse. Jesse, the father of David the king. David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And Solomon, the father of Isn't that an interesting way to list a genealogy? David was the father of Solomon by sin. I mean, this is a straightforward genealogy, isn't it? He doesn't even say, her name. He just says by the wife of Uriah. In case you didn't remember, it's a pretty unique way to say this. And Rehoboam is the father of Abijah. So Rehoboam is the first generation of the divided monarchy. So Jeroboam was a general, and he takes the northerners, and Rehoboam is the son of Solomon, and he begins the southern. It's just Judah, really. And Simeon is involved in that, and Simeon essentially disappears. And by the time you get a few pages into the books of Samuel and Kings, you don't hear about Simeon anymore. You have people named Simeon, but you don't have the tribe of Simeon. Nobody knows who a Simeonite is, And kind of that happens really with the northern tribes too. There's not a whole lot of those tribes that are where people are mentioned by tribe. They're just from the northern kingdom of Israel. And once in a while, you have somebody who is mentioned as being from a particular tribe, but most of the time, it's like the tribe of Benjamin in particular. There's just a few that you hear of here and there, but most of the time, it doesn't matter what tribe they came from. And that actually was not God's original plan. He gave different purposes and identities to each of the tribes when he brought them out of Egypt. And that was on purpose. He wanted them to do different jobs. And that sort of got lost in the shuffle. And there are numerous reasons for that. Anyway, so you skip down from there. You get to some other names that you'll remember. Uzziah, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Amos, Josiah the father of Jeconiah. Now, this is one of, I want to say there's 5. You could say that they're genealogical errors in Matthew's account, but I don't think they're errors. They're intentional. And what he does, so this is one, and it is that Josiah is not the father of Jeconiah. Josiah is the grandfather of Jeconiah. The guy in between them was Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim is specifically named, we'll look at this passage here in a little bit in Jeremiah. But Jehoiakim, I don't even want to name the stuff that Jehoiakim did. It was atrocious. He basically believed that every woman that he encountered was someone that he could have a sexual relationship with. And that included every woman in his family too. So because of his complete sinfulness, and he's a king of Judah too. This is one of David's children. And because of that sin, he's left off of lists like this. So here's the genealogy, and it says that Josiah is the dad of Jeconiah, but Jehoiakim's right in the middle of that. And so when you go back to Jeremiah, let's go back, Jeremiah 36. It's on page 742 in my Bible, if you don't know where Jeremiah is. Isaiah, Jeremiah. Yeah, I don't know. Huh? Yeah, well, who reads that? Okay, Jeremiah 36. This is just one of those little passages that, when the prophets spoke, there was just so much stuff in there that was pertinent to that day and kind of doesn't, you just sort of ignore it because it really, it doesn't have any relevance to today. But here's Jeremiah 36, and you get down here to verse 30. And it says, therefore, thus says the Lord concerning Jehoiakim, king of Judah, he shall have none to sit on the throne of David, and his dead body shall be cast out to the heat by day and the frost by night. And I will punish him and his offspring and his servants for their iniquity. I will bring upon them and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem and upon the people of Judah all the disaster that I have pronounced against them, but they would not hear. You probably never read that passage, and except in your daily, when you do the chronological thing and you're reading through it, then you get to this passage, this obscure passage, Jeremiah 36. You should underline it and side reference it to Matthew 1, because it's a good reference. Jehoiakim's sin was so bad that later on, when God tells Matthew to write the gospel of Jesus Christ, Jehoiakim's not even mentioned in it. It's Jeconiah. And so they skip generations. He's not the only generation. There's 5 generations that are skipped in this genealogy. But that's what. So some people look at Matthew 1 and they're like, hey, this is not historically accurate. That's not even the point of the genealogy. My personal opinion is that this genealogy is tracing back through the substantial characters of the kings. Whether or not they're to be understood literally, is kind of up for debate. Now, you could argue that this is very literal, that this is Joseph's ancestry, that it goes all the way back through David. And it goes through which son of David? Who's the son of David that's mentioned in this genealogy? Solomon. So is Jesus the grandson of Solomon? He is not. Legally, he is. Solomon was the king. Solomon had a brother that you don't know much about. We'll see his name here in just a minute. Wait, Solomon had lots of brothers, but Solomon is the legal heir to the throne. But his oldest brother, Amnon, was killed, right? So there's all these really bad stories that happen in 2 Samuel. It's 11, 12, 13, 14, right around there. And it's the sin that David ignores in his children, where one of his sons rapes one of his daughters. They're half siblings, but this rape happens, and the brothers are indignant that this has happened to their sister. And you know what David does about it? Nothing. And it actually marks the beginning of the end of David. It's one of those things where, when you read the story of David, the Bathsheba incident happens, right? We all know that one. And then you read Psalm 51. Remember Psalm 51? Create in me a new heart, a clean heart, oh God. Remember that? Look at the sin I've committed in my life. Psalm 51 is that it's like a retelling of, I can't believe I've done this. But remember, there's a guy that comes to him and tells him a story that makes him realize how far it's gone. That guy's name is Nathan, right? So Nathan the prophet comes to him and tells him about it. So David is kind of lost in sinfulness and just sort of doesn't realize it. And then you kind of think, okay, he recovers because we've read Psalm 51, create a clean heart in me, right? But what ends up happening is that he winds up just sort of ignoring some stuff that happens in his life, and his children exact revenge, and then it's up to him. So you have all the stuff with Absalom, which we all know about. Absalom had pretty hair and gets caught in a tree and dies, right? Because Joab comes and, spears him a few times, right? So there's that story. Then there's the story of Amnon, which is, I think he's the oldest. There's all these treacherous things that happen in David's children. And they are 100, every one of them is a direct result of something David does. Read through the stories in 2 Samuel and you'll see. The text is very clear that in every one of these incidents, David had something to do with it. Or maybe I should say this. David decided to not have something to do with it. And so when his kids are immoral, he ignores it and doesn't pay attention to it. And let me ask you this. Why do you think that would be? I mean, I've already told you. Why do you think he would choose to ignore immorality in his children? You know why. What? Because he's immoral too. You got it? When you are guilty of sin, it's that much easier to not pay attention to it in other people. And that's exactly what David did. And it doesn't just lead to his downfall or the problem of sin in his life. What it leads to is the entire collapse of his family. And essentially, every kid of his is killed off by another or a commander of an army or something because he doesn't correct them. He doesn't discipline them. And have you ever seen that happen, or have you ever been part of that where you've figured out some atrocity in your life that you're guilty of, and then it's just kind of hard to correct people who need correcting? Because that's what hypocrisy is, right? Pointing out stuff in other people's life. How do you get past that? How do you get past the point of everybody in here has committed sin and stuff that you don't want the rest of us to know about. We know that. But how do you get to the point where you can actually, the scripture calls us to account to not just point out stuff in other people's life, but to help them correct. To call people to confession and then repentance, right? Boy, you sure can't do that very easily when you know what you've done. And I believe that that's the reason for David ignoring the sin in his kids. I think it's actually pretty obvious from the text. And it's precisely why the narration happens the way that it does. A guy named Gad probably wrote the books of Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. And he was a prophet at the time of David, but sometimes after that. Nathan was the guy who interacted with David the most, but there was another guy named Gad, and he is most likely the author of those books. So you have David ignoring the sin in his children's lives, and then that leads to this story of what will happen next. And you have moral decay spiraling out of control. So what begins as something what David did was like list the top 3 sins, like the worst things that you could do, and that's what David did, right? So that's what David did, and then he excused it in his children, and then there's rape in the family, and there's no call to deal with that sin. And so what winds up happening is the kids all spiral out of control. So you have Solomon, who Matthew says is the son, is the son of the wife of Uriah, right? And then you have another son mentioned in Luke's account. So let's go over to Luke. Luke 3. So we're not talking about the Gospel of Luke, but I just want you to, so Matthew is tying things to the Old Testament. I mean, they wouldn't have called it the Old Testament. So what we call the Old Testament, they would have called Scripture, right? So what Matthew is trying to do is tie Jesus to Scripture. And so his genealogy is at the beginning. Luke's genealogy is completely different. So he does his typical, if you look through your little subtitles here, in the very beginning, he does his introduction to Theophilus, which of course Acts has, so that's how you know these two books are linked. He talks about the things that happen right before the birth. So you have the stuff about John the Baptist, you have the stuff about Mary and Elizabeth, and then you have the birth of John and some of his the prophecy that surrounds him and some of his teaching. And then in chapter 2, you have the birth of Jesus, which he makes a bigger deal out of than anybody else does, and tells so much of it because, again, this is stuff that mattered to Mary. It's multiple times in the text, he says things like, Mary treasured these things. Mary pondered these things. She was confused about them. She wondered about them. And the point is that even though Mary believed what God said, she was curious as to how it would work out. And she even questions, when the angel speaks to her, she even questions, she says, since I do not know a man, right? Remember that? So she's pretty smart for a young teenager, and she's questioning things. So here's the thing is, Mary's acceptance of God's blessing on her involves her saying something to the effect of, hey, do what you've said. Do you remember from last week somebody who said that? We read through 2 Samuel 7, and God pronounces his covenant, his 7-part covenant to David. And at the end of that, David says what? I trust you, now do what you've said. It's this call to account that happens, where people say to God, okay, I believe you, but just make sure you do it, right? And Mary ends up saying something very similar. So before we look at Luke 3, I'm going to look at 2 Samuel 7, and I just want you to see something over there. So you hold your finger here. 2 Samuel 7, I'm just going to read this little blurb at the end after God has given these 7 parts of the promise, some that are very clearly centered around Solomon, but have significance into the future. Remember, we've talked about prophets before. Prophets, it's like they had multiple lenses in front of them. And so, Isaiah would talk about his son. In the first part of Isaiah, he would be talking about, unto us a child is born, right? He wasn't actually talking about Jesus right then. You know who he was talking about? His son. He was actually talking about his son. But it did have particular relevance to someone who would be born later. And a lot of what Isaiah said about his son wouldn't come true in his son. It would come true in another one of the royal family. Isaiah was of the royal family. It would come from someone else in his family, Jesus, who would come 600 and something years later. So here's what David says at the end of God's promise to him. David has this huge prayer of gratitude. You can see in 2 Samuel 7, beginning verse 18, who am I and what is my house? And then he says, you're great. There's none like you. And then he says something later about, who is the house of Israel or the house of David? And why are you paying attention to us, right? So he has all these statements. And look in verse 25. He says, and now, O Lord God, confirm forever the word that you have spoken concerning your servant and concerning his house, and do as you have spoken. So this isn't all blessings that God is. So I want you to just be aware of this. God gives 7 blessings. In them are also a couple of what you might say anti-blessings, or a couple that you could understand them as curses in a way. So let's go back up into verse 14, where he talks about his son, and he says, this is God speaking to David about his son. that would build him a house. And obviously, David thinks, oh, well, Solomon's going to build the house. Because this whole thing started out of David wanted to build a house for God. And so God said, no, I don't want you to build my house. Your son will, right? And so here in verse 14, it's pretty obvious. It's talking about Solomon. But it's talking about Solomon's kids too. So listen to this. He shall build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Then comes what you could call an anti-blessing. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. And then you kind of get back to the blessing part of it when he says, but my steadfast love will not depart from him as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. In fact, when Saul sins, Samuel says to him, actually God says to him through Samuel, he says, I would have established your house forever. Even though the promise had come through Judah and you're not from that family, if you hadn't been the kind of person you are, I would have gone ahead and established your kingdom forever. God said that to him. But he was terrible. He was just not just an immoral leader. He was just a terrible person. And then when he finds out about David, what does he try to do? Multiple times. He tries to kill him, right? So this is God's anointed. Whereas David tries to say, so this is how David sets himself apart, is that when his men want to kill Saul, what does David say? Multiple times as well. You're not going to kill God's anointed, right? So David has a profound respect and honor for the one whom God chooses. Even though God didn't choose Saul, the people did, God still put him in his throne and still allowed him to rule. And David doesn't allow his men to take Saul's life because he understands, hey, this is a person who God is ruling through. He may not be doing it perfectly, but we honor that office. We honor the throne of God. And so here we are in this statement that's given to David, and he says, I'll be a father to him, he'll be a son to me. And he says, if he messes it up, I'm going to discipline him. That's an interesting statement, isn't it? So is that the statement you expect to hear right here? When somebody messes something up, what do you think God does?
He usually lets us suffer through the consequences.
Right? Right. So sometimes it just...
He loves us, he will still redeem us, but, you know.
Sometimes it has to work its own self out, right? Like he just kind of lets it sit, right? But it's a form of discipline, right? That no father loves his son unless he disciplines him. And that's just the truth. And this is about, think about this, is about David, right? So here's before the fact, and God says to him, if your son messes it up, if he commits iniquity, I'll discipline him. So it's not only a promise, it's a warning, right? You better discipline your children too, because you're my child. Solomon's going to be my child. And I'm going to discipline him. But here's the thing that's not said in that text. I'm going to cut him off. I'm going to eliminate the throne from his family. Do you see that? This is a very specific statement from God about the house of David. And that it's this and many other passages where you get the teaching that the throne of David would last forever, that it would never be taken away. And it's because even when God speaks correctively, or speaks, and an anti-blessing is actually a thing. When Jacob pronounced the blessing over his children, were they all positive? No, but see, the Jews knew blessings would come true because they believed that God was speaking through the Father about the future. They believed them to be prophetic. So when the Father spoke blessings over his kids, he didn't do it, with reckless abandon. He was in touch with the Lord as to what was going to happen in this person's life. And so when he pronounces upon Judah that the scepter will not depart, the staff will not depart from his feet or leave his feet, he's speaking on God's behalf to Judah. And they all know that's what's going to happen. So when God says this to David, when your son commits iniquity, there's number one, a sort of a matter of fact part to that. When he does, not if, but when he does, because it's just a part of life. But when he commits iniquity, I will discipline him. And I'm going to discipline the two different kinds of discipline. One's, kind of a sort of a smack, wake up. The other one's like a good sound beating, I mean, these are two different, it's like, and that's what it takes. Like, corrective discipline is not just, it can't always just be like a, hey, wake up. Sometimes you actually have to do something more severe. Sometimes discipline's much stronger. And that's what he's talking about, is that depending on what the iniquity is, I'm going to deal with that. But he's also giving a warning to David about disciplining his own kids. The very thing. So David hears this and he says, at the end of it, he says, confirm forever and do as you have spoken. And we get it. God's the only covenant keeper, right? He's the only one who's going to keep this covenant. And yet, at the same time, God's warning him about, you better do this too. And David doesn't hear it. So when his son rapes his daughter, he ignores it. So this winds up coming back on them, on the house, in very strong fashion. Okay, so David through Solomon gets us to Joseph. Now, how do we get from David to Mary? It's a little bit interesting. So go back to Luke 3. If you still, like 10 minutes ago, I told you to mark that with your finger. You probably already lost it by now. But at the end of Luke chapter 3, Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph, the son of Heli. You see the problem with that? You have to be talking about somebody else, because we just read who Joseph's dad was, and it wasn't this guy. It was Jacob. And so now he's the son of Heli. So it has always been believed that this is tracing back through Mary. So here's the thing. Who does this go back through? Now, I've already kind of posed that question for you. Which son of David does this genealogy trace back to? Nathan. Who's that? So Jesus' blood lineage and legal lineage go back to David. No matter how you look at it, Jesus has the right to be the king on David's throne. He does. So what Matthew and Luke have done is they've traced him through both parents back. We understand that Jesus did not have a physical father, as we all do. So Joseph isn't his biological dad, but he is his legal dad. So these curses that get pronounced back at the time of Jehoiakim and even at the time of David, those are basically 600 and 1,000 years before the time of Jesus. And the lineage gets split. You have David giving Solomon the kingship, and you have David and Nathan. You have two sons. The lineage is basically split, and you have Joseph and Mary coming from those two sons of David. But the lineage is split, and when God pronounces curses on the house of David, which will happen later, and he says that, and basically at the time that Zedekiah is taken out, the last son of David is taken out to Babylon, the story seems to be over. It seems that there will never be another king, a son of David, ruling over the house of Israel. And here's the other thing, is that anyone who ever did rule over the house of Israel that wasn't a son of David did it by usurping. Because God never wanted anyone. And so you actually have periods of time after the fall of Israel and after the fall of Judah that certain prophets and priests would rise up and try to rule over the house of Israel. Because groups of Israel came back after the deportation into Babylon. And some of them came back in small groups and then larger groups, but some of them came back. And you have prophets and priests who are actually illegitimate priests, by the way, who wind up trying to take the kingship of Israel. And so you have these three groups of leaders, prophets, priests, kings, kind of sort of being pushed into one person. He's trying to basically lead the worship of the house of Israel. He's trying to speak to the future and teach the people, and he's trying to rule the house of David. You have multiple characters from the years after 586 when Judah falls to the time of Jesus. You have multiple people trying to lead the house of Israel, the house of David. But all of them do so illegitimately, every one of them. And then you have this guy who's born in this unassuming place in the house of bread. Bethlehem is the house of bread. Of all places, it's like impoverished. You know, it's just a few miles outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem sits up on the city hill. It's the place where all the nobility and the rich people live. And Bethlehem are the servants of the nobility. And in the house of bread is this little baby born in an unassuming place, in an unassuming way, and yet nobility from Persia come to see him because the tradition has been handed down for years and years and years, and they've heard about Messiah, and they want to know about him. And when the star appears, they travel great distance to come all the way from Persia to see about this great king who is to be born. And then they find this baby in a feeding trough. And they must have been shocked. This isn't what we expected. He's not a child of nobility. You know, the lineage goes back to the house of David twice. And he was just there actually because of the census that happened. How weird is that? And in no other circumstance would he have been a part of Bethlehem. And actually, there's two Bethlehems. There's a Bethlehem that's closer to Nazareth, where his parents were from. And if any Bethlehem that would have been mentioned in the Old Testament, you would think that's where they would have like, hey, we want our kid to be like, you know, the child that's born in Bethlehem. So maybe we should bring him to this one that's close to Nazareth, not that really poor one down there by Jerusalem. And still, everything lines perfectly up. And Jesus is born in the right Bethlehem, the Bethlehem of Ephraim, or your translations will say Bethlehem of Ephrathah, which is most likely just a miswrite in this. It's a scribal error because it's just one consonant off of Ephraim, which is where this Bethlehem was. And so it seems to be that what God is doing is setting up something that's beyond impossible, that Jesus, this guy who's the son of David twice, would be born, and he would actually be a legitimate heir because God had disciplined them. And it seemed like there could not be someone who could be born into the house of David and legitimately rule because he had been disciplined. But he could if he didn't come from Solomon's family, because it was Jeconiah who was cursed. And he's left out of the lineage leading to Joseph. It's interesting. There's a whole lot of theories about this, and I won't be strong-headed about any of this. It's just something to be aware of, that when you get to Jesus, the New Testament writers are very aware of the questions that would be raised about this guy. And the reason they are is because in the few hundred years before Jesus is born, there are lots of people who try to usurp leadership, to take it over. And in fact, there's a couple of books about the Maccabees. And if you've never read the books of the Maccabees, you should. It's fantastic reading. And it's true to life. It's historical account. And basically, the Maccabean family were like guerrilla warfare specialists that took it out on the Jews who weren't living in an I don't always say orthodox manner, but they weren't living in the right way. So they were not bringing their sacrifices before the Lord and all that. So they come out of the hills and they exact God's revenge on the people of God. And in that honestly leads to their own downfall. They wind up kind of setting themselves up. They, instead of just exacting God's revenge, they wind up saying, hey, you know what? We're kind of in power. Let's not lose it. And so they try to take the power. And they're not the only ones. There were multiple people who tried to rule on David's throne, and it didn't work. And then Jesus comes along, and this little baby born in Nowheresville winds up becoming the King of Kings. And you couldn't, somebody was telling me the other day that there are lots of studies that have been done on, the statistical probability of Jesus fulfilling the prophecies that are given of him in the Old Testament. And, it's one of those ridiculous numbers that, like, you could cover the state of Texas in 5 feet of golf balls, and you have to pick that one. It's one of those things. And the reality is that that's not the real reason I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That's part of it. I mean, the probability is incredible. But the more attached you become to Christ, and the more you see who he is, who he was, who he is, and how it changes you, and that's the only way to live, evidence doesn't matter as much. Physical, scientific, historical, archaeological, all the evidence is important. I'm not saying it brings people to faith. It increases faith. But when you get to know the character of the Lord, that's the final determinant. That's what brings you to the full faith. And the character of Judah and David, these guys were both good guys in their own right, in ways. And yet they were complete reprobates. And so here's the lineage of Jesus, kingly inheritance. And he's nothing like them. I read the story of Judah and I'm completely appalled. And I read the story of David and I am for the same reasons, because it reminds me of me. And I read the story of Jesus and he's nothing like me. And I love that. That is faith for me. That's something big. I don't want to be like David, and I don't want to be like Judah. I appreciate their place in history, but I want to be like the King of Kings. He does not rule the way that Samuel warned the people when they asked for a king. He doesn't rule that way. He rules in the hearts of people, changing lives, not demanding life changes, but helping, assisting us to change. And it's his willpower that works in us to make us the people that we're supposed to be true image bearers of the King into the world. So we have some more that I want to do about the reign of God. So I hope to be able to wrap that up next week. We're out of time for tonight. But I hope that you're seeing some of these connections, and maybe it's making some things make sense for you. Judah, David, Jesus, which one's the rightful heir to the throne? So next week, what I intend to do to wrap it up is just talk about some of these prophecies that talk about the throne of God, the reign of God, and who sits on the throne, and why God does he abdicate, or is someone substituting? There's a whole way of understanding that, and that's what I want to talk about next week. The kingdom of God, is it something yet to come? Is it something that is here? And if so, what's happening? So we'll try to solve some of those next week. Thank you.